Gerald Posner right now. He's a veteran investigative reporter who has dedicated much of his career to reporting on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He's the author of Case Closed, that dismantles many of the most famous conspiracy theories about the assassination of JFK. He was also interviewed for the Frontline documentary, Who Was Lee Harvey Oswald, that is considered one of the most definitive docs on the event that's happened. He also authored many other investigative books, including one on the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Gerald, it is such a pleasure to have you on tonight. It's great to see you again. You are probably the best guest, I think, in this country to have on this topic tonight. So more than 30 years ago, you wrote the book and you concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald killed JFK by himself. As someone who's an expert, is there anything in these files you're curious about?
Yeah, there are things, Tom. I mean, I'd love to see there are some files that are still sealed about the mafia and CIA plots against Fidel Castro. I'd like to know more about that. There's a document in there on Mexican intelligence information was gathered on Oswald when Lee Harvey Oswald visited Mexico City only 6 weeks before the assassination. And it might disclose the extent to which the CIA knew how unbalanced Oswald was, and they didn't tell the FBI. So there could be some embarrassing things in here. It'll be interesting for history. But I don't think what most Americans are looking for, which is a smoking gun document that will turn the case on its head and say, hey, here's who killed Kennedy, who's really part of the secret government, and here are the people involved. That's not going to happen.
You gave us a little bit of a nugget there, so I do want to ask you about that. Do we know why Oswald goes to Mexico City and goes to the Cuban embassy?
Yeah, it's so interesting. He's only 23 years old at the time because he just turns 24 when he gets up in a window and shoots at President Kennedy in November. He wants to go to Havana, where he thinks the real revolution is happening. He's a leftist went to the Soviet Union. He went after he was in the Marine Corps and said, I'm turning up here and I want to be part of the Russian Revolution. Then he hated it there. He thought that they had ruined communism. Came back to America and thought that this was equally bad. And then he looked to get to Cuba, but he was turned down in his travel plans by both the Soviets and by the Cubans. And when he came back to America in early October, only 6 weeks before Kennedy visited Dallas, he was dejected and in the worst mood he had been in. He had just failed a few months earlier to try to shoot and kill a retired Army general. So Oswald was sort of a powder keg ready to explode. And the president ends up taking a motorcade route that goes right in front of where Oswald works. It's one of those things you couldn't make up out of a movie, but it happened in reality.
And just to be clear, what your book, proves in a way, and what that Frontline documentary also proved when it came out in 1993, you think that Lee Harvey Oswald, by himself, assassinated John F. Kennedy by shooting him from the bookstore. There are no arguments and no questions about it, in your opinion.
There's no question at all that Oswald was the assassin that day at Dealey Plaza in Dallas. So the only question is, did he do it for himself or did he do it as part of a plot? That's always the toughest question. I've looked at those connections to see whether he did it. Did he do it for the CIA? Did he do it for the Russians? Did he do it to impress Castro because he wanted to get to Cuba? There are all of those possibilities. But in the end, what's missing, Tom, is proof and evidence. And it's not going to be sitting there in a file that's been sitting in the National Archives for all of these decades. I think what will happen is if these files don't provide the evidence of conspiracy, which many people are looking for, and President Trump has raised the expectations with this dramatic executive order, then Robert Kennedy and others are going to ask him to appoint in essence, like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to say, let's look for assassination documents wherever they are in the government. I don't think that this case will be resolved to everybody's satisfaction after the files are
Gerald,
released.
one of the big questions which led to a lot of conspiracy theories were, how did Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who killed Lee Harvey Oswald before he even goes on trial, on live TV at the Dallas police headquarters, how was that able to happen? And do you think there might be any documents connected to that?
You asked the key question, as far as I'm concerned, as a reporter, and it's the same thing I had when I started to research the case in the early 90s. I thought it was a conspiracy because I thought Ruby's murder of Oswald, only you have a guy who looks like he's out of central casting for the mafia, shooting the accused assassin of the President of the United States 2 days after he's arrested in police custody. It looks like a mob silencing, or he's been silenced. We've all seen those movies. So I was convinced that that's what it was. It's only when I went and followed the evidence that I realized it wasn't the case. Will there be more information in those files on Ruby? Possibly, but we're not going to find anything. We've looked already to see the mob connections. They don't exist. We've looked to see in his background. Ruby turns out to be just somebody who's ruined the case for history by having killed Oswald for his own warped motivations, thinking that he was going to be a hero for killing the person who had killed the president. Instead, he ruined it for history.
The documents related to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. will also be released. In recent history, his daughter has said, I want to put this up for our viewers here, Bernice King strongly contends that there is still a search for answers, as the assassination of her father was a culminated effort involving, quote, federal, state, and local governments, including the Memphis Police Department. More than a half century after his assassination, Bernice King told the Griot that James Earl Way, the man convicted in Dr. King's murder, was used as a diversion with the gun that he had. Could more on this potentially be revealed, and what do you think about that as somebody who's written a book on it?
I think that when it comes to the families, RFK Jr., the King family, it's very emotional. They're involved in a lot of things, and especially the King family. They know that the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI. They were after Martin Luther King. They were trying to disgrace him. They had illegal surveillance on him, on his personal life. So when he was killed, of course, they feel, it just can't be this guy, James Earl Ray, who did it on his own. The shame of it is for the King family is that they've sort of absolved Ray of any responsibility. And again, Tom, I'm convinced from my own reinvestigation of the case, I published those results in '98, James Earl Ray was the fellow who shot Martin Luther King that day in Memphis. The question has always been, did he do it again for himself or as part of a plot? I think he did it for money that was coming out of the Midwest from a racist who was offering a bounty of up to $50,000 on Dr. King. So small conspiracy, but not the type of conspiracy that I think the King family and many other Americans are looking for, which is sort of a government secret state conspiracy.
We're talking about a half century here, right, Gerald? So I guess my question to you is, why would the government hold on to these documents for so long, right? Because in the first Trump administration, all of them could have been released as well, and they weren't. President Bill Clinton, going back to the 90s, had made a similar promise and released some documents, or had sort of set the stage so we could get to this point. And my question is, do you think the reason why they didn't release them, you could wonder, hey, maybe they didn't want to reveal information sources, intel sources, but it's been half a century. Do you think it's because it'll look embarrassing the way they investigated it, or were they fumbled clues?
I think there are two reasons why. You have pencil pushers inside the bureaucracy who sort of dot every I and cross every T, and they say, gee, this is the name of a former intelligence asset who's still alive, and our rule is we don't release that information. There are social security numbers in there, a lot of social security numbers. We don't release that. There are tax returns in there of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. Tax returns aren't released. So the bureaucratic pencil pushers, they all say, let's follow the rules and not release them. And then there are others at the CIA who, for I think decades, said, this is embarrassing to the agency because we should have told the FBI that Oswald was that unhinged when we found out about his behavior 6 weeks before in Mexico City. So that's going to come out, and it should be out. So my view of this, Tom, is that one of the worst things the government has done is sealed these files and held onto them for so many decades. Because one of the first things I run into if I talk to somebody about one of these assassinations is, hey, why do they have all the files still locked up? They must be hiding a big secret. So it's good today that Trump is ordering them to be released.
Finally, I have to ask you, and it can't be lost on us, President Trump is someone who survived an assassination attempt, right? Do you think that had any effect in the decision today?
It had to play a role if you're thinking about a presidential assassination. The last president assassinated was Jack Kennedy in 1963. And but for an inch of difference, we could have been talking about Donald Trump as the last president assassinated. So he has to think about those files. And I do think that RFK Jr. had a tremendous impact on him. Look, the Kennedy family is split. You reported on that on the lead-in. There's no doubt about that. Many of them do not agree with him. But he is the one, RFK Jr., who has Trump's ear. And I think that Trump agreed. RFK Jr. backed him, and one of the agreements that was made as a quid pro quo was that these files would be released as a top of Trump's to-do list, and he followed through today.
Gerald Posner, always a fascinating conversation. We appreciate you joining Top Story tonight.
Thanks, Tom.